Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the program once again this evening. Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Akin. It's nice to be here, and I look forward to the interaction with our viewers. Thank you.
Yes, Prof. Thank you for that. Sir, last week we ended on a question that I couldn't ask, and that was the question regarding Russia. And I want to go straight into it this week. And that is the fact that Russia has been accused of weaponizing its gas supply to Europe, an allegation which President Putin has denied. What is your view on that situation, sir?
Um, I just don't understand why people think all of us are at the level of international relations 001. Um, every country seeks to maximize whatever advantages it can gain from its economic position. Equally, superpowers tend to use their manipulation of the market to destroy the economies of countries that they find um, difficult. Let's put it that way. I can give you examples. Early in the independence of several African countries, whose economy depended on high prices for cocoa and the prices, or coffee for that matter, and the prices were determined by the markets in Europe. The European countries manipulated those prices to punish radical countries by depressing the price of their commodities, or to reward uh, countries that are on their side by uh, some artificially boosting the prices of their commodities. So this is something countries do. So I'm now surprised that they will accuse Russia of wanting to play the game that they probably taught Russia very well. And I'm not surprised that Putin would deny doing so. Of course, he would be foolish to admit that this was something he was doing. So uh, the allegation doesn't surprise me, the denial doesn't surprise me. But what I'm certain of is if the occasion calls for it and Putin can use it, he will do so.
While we're on Russia, sir, Russia has announced the suspension of its mission to NATO on the basis that they have been accused, they've expelled some Russian staff, and they have been accused of spying. Would this make any significant change to the dynamics of NATO and Russia?
No, it will not. If you are expecting a seismic change or an earthquake change, no. It is expected if you catch citizens of one, diplomats of one country spying, or you suspect them of spying, you expel them. You are also expecting retaliation in the sense that your own people on the other side will also be expelled. It's a quid pro quo. So to that extent, as soon as I heard that the EU, that NATO was expelling some Russian who've been caught sort of embarrassingly in, you know, counterintelligence operations, I was expecting that Russia would retaliate. What has surprised me, however, is that the Russian reaction seems to have gone overboard. They've actually shut down the NATO mission um, in Russia. So my suspicion then is that the Russians who were expelled by NATO must have been, high-ranking intelligence officers that the only way Russia could show that it's been hurt badly is to shut down the entire NATO operation. Of course, they won't announce to us when they work out the deals behind, the curtain, so to speak. People are allowed to come back. But you know, it's a tit for tat intelligence game.
So last week there was also another question that we couldn't take, and this was the absence of Russia and China from conversations around Afghanistan. Now, we've seen further developments that yesterday Russia held talks with the Taliban, and they seem to have officially recognized the Taliban. What do you have to say with how Russia has gone about almost unilaterally holding their own summit, if you will, with Afghanistan and shunning the group initiative to address the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan?
Um, what has taken place is a bit more complex than that. Number one, even the Russians made it plain to the Taliban that they were not recognizing them. So there's not going to be any unilateral action by Russia uh, that can confer any legitimacy on the Taliban. Number two, quite clever, the Russians said they were calling on the United Nations uh, to, in a way, organize a conference or create a platform where the issues of humanitarian aid uh, to Afghanistan, not the Taliban, to Afghanistan, could be discussed. That was a clever move on the part of the Russians, because they were saying, unlike the United States, that was pushing for, if you like, an American led uh, platform, an American led approach on the Taliban issue, we, the Russians, are prepared to work with the United Nations. We are not going to try and play any unilateral ball on this matter. Number four, you'll notice that the Russian initiative actually brought in um, China, India, and Pakistan. So in a way, it's like a neighborhood watch approach, where the people in the Asian community, where the people who live next door to Afghanistan, uh, we are the people who the impact on us of what is happening in Afghanistan is likely to be more profound than the impact on the Americans. Um, and even though uh, uh, Biden has been trying to draw India into the what will you call it, the democracy um, platform, uh, to look at what's happening in Afghanistan. The Russians are not playing any ideological card. And finally, even what the Russians were emphasizing is not really that materially different from what the Americans are pushing, which is because the Russians told the Taliban international recognition will depend on fulfilling the promises you made about running an inclusive government, allowing women and girls, to go to school, and cracking down on the activities of ISIS-K. I think of those three or four, probably the one that's most important to Russia is the activity of ISIS-K, because don't forget that Russia fought a war for donkey years in Chechen, and therefore Russian internal system is still susceptible to um, activities of terrorist organizations. But I was surprised, I must confess, that um, India showed up at that conference, because India has been showing up at the conferences organized by the United States. But I think that uh, the India is wherever Pakistan is, India wants to be on the scene to hear what is being said, because of the bilateral tension between India and Pakistan. So it's been a very clever move, I must say, by the Russians. Um, and I'm not surprised, because the foreign minister of Russia is an old hand at foreign policy formulation, foreign policy processes. And Putin himself, even though he came via the intelligence organization of first the Soviet Union and now Russia, himself is not it's not naive when it comes to foreign policy. I think this has been for a successful week for Russia. And if the Taliban thinks it can perhaps divide the world into pro-Taliban and anti-Taliban spheres, it probably by now will learn that the world is united on the issue of anti-terrorism, and on the issue also of education for women and girls.
Thank you for that, sir. Someone has just drawn our attention to a point here, taking us back to the Russia NATO point. And the fact here is that NATO defense ministers are working on agreeing a master plan on how they can defend against any potential threats from Russia, particularly threats that may happen simultaneously and may involve nuclear weapons. Um, what kind of strategy do you see NATO being able to come up with to deter such an attack?
Well, the foundation of NATO ran on the basis of an attack on one is an attack on all. Under Trump, the feeling amongst NATO countries is that this commitment was weakened. And given the way the United States pulled out of Afghanistan and the alliance, quote unquote, between United Kingdom, USA, and Australia, NATO is a bit uneasy about the extent to which it can rely on this solid commitment from the United States should Putin decide to test the waters when it comes to nuclear aggression. I don't believe Putin would do that. I don't think Putin wants a world war or a nuclear war in Europe or in the world for that matter. But as I said last week, and I also believe maybe the week before, we are planning and plotting a new world order. And people are, a world order is like a round piece of pizza. Each person is there with his own knife. You want to cut so that you have your own sector. And you want to be sure that what you are left with is not just, while it's a piece of the pie, it's not a minuscule piece of the pie. It's something substantial. And it started, I would say, with the Russians taking Crimea, and nothing happened apart from just condemnation. Nothing happened. It's like it's got away with it. So that's why I think that that NATO is sending out signals that it's not going to just sit back and allow the United States alone to define what the anti-Russian strategy is going to be in case of nuclear pressure from Russia. but that they themselves want to have their own strategy, something that will make Macron very happy because he's been pushing for this.
Before we leave the Russia point, there's a question I want to put to you, which I think would actually be a good segue into the issue of COVID 19. Russia has now announced that they will be going into a lockdown in about 10 days' time because the situation is getting really bad. In the United Kingdom, the number of cases has also now gone above 50,000. And across the political class here, there is a lot of pressure on the prime minister to start to reintroduce some measures and not wait until things become really critical. What do you say to this worsening situation, sir?
Uh, I think that the scientists have been warning us that winter had always been a favorable, fertile period for not only this virus, but really all kinds of virus that come along. You'll recall that the normal flu season, influenza season, is usually the winter period. So they've always been warning us. But I think there has been also this hope that the introduction of the um, vaccine will temper the impact of uh, the virus, COVID 19, during the winter months, where we are starting to see evidence that that may just not be so, that this virus has this capability for mutation, uh, and that the vaccine, while it's proved very useful, the vaccine doesn't really kill off the virus. Even people who have received both doses, um, um, depending on their age, depending on their medical conditions, and also now among children, could still be susceptible to you know unwelcomed and unwarranted consequences. So we've seen it in Russia now, and as you say, we've seen it climbing in the United Kingdom. Presumably, we'll be waiting for two geographical regions, the United States and continental Europe, to see what their own pictures will look like. So the Russians have quickly shown their hand um, about having a lockdown, probably because they have not inoculated or injected as many they haven't injected the high percentage of their people as probably they should have or they would like to. The In Britain, the United Kingdom, they are adopting the attitude of watch and see, because really the the issue is still out there whether a lockdown really helps or whether it's just having an exposure that will lead to herd immunity that will help. there's no definitive answer to that. So, like government, scientists, we'll just keep our fingers crossed and um, that hope that this virus is not going to come and ruin everybody's Christmas. It has already indicated uh, that there are going to be unfortunate consequences because there are Christmas trees, Christmas presents that are stuck, in on ships. Either they are stuck in the store of the manufacturers because there are no ships to come and take them out, since the ships all seem to have been stuck in this area. Uh, and then for the ships that I even managed to get across the docks, uh, uh, there is a congestion at the docks to allow for them to be evacuated and to get to the stores. So already we are having a vaccine Christmas that we don't want. And let us hope that the situation is not going uh, to be worse than what our fears lead us to expect.
Let me move the conversation slightly to the United States, where COVID 19 has sadly taken a very, very important personnel when it comes to the military, leadership, and even politics to a large extent. And that's in the person of Colin Powell. Now, I'm going to take a gamble here, but I assume that at some point you may have met Colin Powell. Um, who was he? What kind of a person was he?
Um, I think Colin Powell is going to um, turn up in the history of our time as an extremely uh, personable, wise um, personality that has left his footprints um, on our history. Uh, yes, I met him, but uh, I didn't really work with him uh, um, on the trajectory of foreign policy. Um, the first time I will meet him, he was National Security Advisor to Reagan, and they came to the Reagan came to the United Nations to give the American speech. And the tradition is that the Secretary General of the United Nations will host him to a luncheon after the the president's speech. Um, and so, we all went into the big dining hall, and I then decided to go and use um, the washroom, uh, only to have the door blocked by Secret Service men, and the Nigerian ambassador then kind of whispered to them, you know, um, Nigerian foreign minister. So, of course, they let me go in, and there was Colin Powell. Um, uh, well, doing what cannot be delegated. Um, so we just looked at each other, smiled, and he went out. And when I finished, I went out, only to then discover that both of us actually had been allocated to the same table in the luncheon hall. And of course, we then laughed, and I formally introduced myself, and he introduced, himself. He told me he wasn't as that was the beginning of his climb up the ladder. So it wasn't as if I was meeting a Kissinger. No, I really didn't know who he was, and I'm sure he didn't know who I was to that extent. But I dealt more with George Schloss, who was the Secretary of State, and who had come visiting Nigeria, and I had been to visit him in Washington. But we talked. I can't remember what we talked about anyway, because you had to wait to listen to the president again deliver some extemporal remarks, while Secretary General will also say his own. And then, of course, we will all scatter after that. But my interaction with him, which then happened many, many years later, which left an impression on me, was I was in exile in London during the anti-Abacha days, when a National Democratic Coalition organization was fighting the military in Nigeria. And he made a statement to the extent that all, well, he didn't say, oh, don't let me put what's in his mouth. Because really, since he died, I've been looking for his real statement. But it was to the effect that Nigerians were crooks. And I wrote a letter to him saying this was unfair to Nigerians and to Nigeria, that not all of us were crooks. He wrote back a personal letter of apology. Now, let me remind you, I wasn't a foreign minister anymore. It was my own post foreign minister days. I was a member of, the National Democratic Coalition. So he could have ignored the letter. In fact, I suspect that he got several letters from several Nigerians, protesting what he has said. And if you know Nigerians, I'm sure some of the letters were pretty rude, but mine was not. Yeah, no, I'm a professor. I was a former foreign minister, a former director general of Institute of International Affairs. So I knew how to couch, protests with a diplomatic favor. But he wrote back apologizing that he didn't mean it the way it can come out. So, to me, you cannot be more humble than that. You could have told me to get lost. And there is a former American Secretary of State who actually told me to get lost because I protested at something he had done, which I regarded as not being fair to Nigeria. And it was, who are you? This uppity, young fellow that he had never heard about, writing to him, and he told me of. But that was not Colin Powell. Um, I regret that he didn't run for office in 1996. I stick my neck out by saying I think he would have not only won the primary of the Republican Party, I really think he would have been elected president. Um, and he would have made an excellent president. He was he was a popular man at a time in America where, I mean, people now say it. It was the first, okay, let's call a spade a spade. It was the first African American national security advisor. He was the first African American chairman, joint services chief, and there hasn't been any since then. He was the first African American Secretary of State. And yet all of this did not go to his head. He did not wear all those ranks upon his shoulder. I I think the world met a man of stature, a man of genius, not in the sense of Einstein, but a genius within his own areas. Since he died, people have said that speech he gave at the United Nations when he was Secretary of State, saying Saddam Hussein of Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, that it was a dent on his career and his character. I don't buy that. He didn't manufacture that intelligence. He wasn't head of CIA. He was even no longer national security advisor to say that he had access to independent intelligence. He wasn't the president who had to make a final determination of what intelligence to accept or not accept. He was Secretary of State. He was a minister subject to orders by the president. Even though, true to his character, he accepted responsibility for that speech, I think I wouldn't have done so because, as I said, he wasn't responsible for that intelligence. But it shows the man's character, that he will stand up and take the punch rather than the president. The world's lost a statesman of high caliber, for that matter.
Thank you for that, sir. Now, sir, there is a point I want to put to you. Now, this is one where I am hoping you will put your teacher's hat on and help us to dissect this point. Because we seem to be seeing the issue growing, not just in Brazil. We've also seen the same thing happening in Yemen. And this is where a group of lawyers have come together and they've decided that they want to take the president of the country to the International Court of Justice or the World Court for crimes against humanity. Now, the same thing we've seen in Yemen, where a group of lawyers have come together and have decided, based on this principle of universal jurisdiction. I have no idea what that means in practice, but they are doing exactly the same thing where they have brought the governments of the UAE and Saudi to the United Kingdom and reported them to the Crown Prosecution Service. My question is this: how effective is it to take your leaders to the criminal court, or even take them to another country like the United Kingdom? How effective is that as a deterrent?
Um, you've lumped several issues together, several legal uh, issues, principles together. So let's try and tease them out. Number one, you as an individual lawyer or as an NGO cannot, repeat, cannot take your president to the World Court. Only states being parties to the World Court have locus to take another state to the World Court. So, Mexico can take Brazil to the World Court. Sudan can take Ethiopia to the World Court. But the average citizen, whether a lawyer or not, does not have access to the World Court. However, an NGO or a lawyer, a group of lawyers, can go to the International Criminal Court and file complaints there. Those are two separate courts. Two separate courts. So lawyers who ought to know better, fly papers up and down, we are taking our president or we are taking that state to the World Court is a non-starter. The principle of universal jurisdiction, or something that came up actually within the EU, where it became a law that whether heads of state or attorney general or minister of defense of any country in the world that is guilty or that is suspected of having committed acts against human rights and finds himself within the European Union, can be arrested and tried in any state of the EU for activities that he had done elsewhere. The only time I can remember where it was actually where it was actually where it was actually used was against, I think, General Pinochet of Chile, who ended up I think it started in Spain and somehow ended up in the United Kingdom. And he was arrested for what he did in Chile when he was part of the government in Chile. And he was arrested. I know he wasn't jailed, let me put it that way. Now I can't remember too well what happened, but he was sent back to Chile, probably on a technicality. This doctrine of universal jurisdiction then became a diplomatic beehive when some NGOs threatened that any Israeli minister or prime minister who found himself in Europe, they will ask for him to be arrested for whatever Israel was doing in the Palestinian land, whether it was dealing with the Intifada or was dealing whatever it was. And unfortunately for that doctrine, it also came up after the Iraqi war, when some NGOs threatened that if Bush the son or Cheney or Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense in the United States, if they found themselves in Europe, they were going to file an application for their arrest. And people now felt, wait a minute, this legal doctrine has now got out of hand. That's not going to help diplomacy. And I think quietly, people stop talking about it and they stop enforcing it. Now, obviously, it hadn't died. If, as you say, a group of lawyers are now have now filed a complaint with the Crown Prosecution Service against the UAE and Saudi Arabia for the war going on in Yemen. Obviously, that doctrine then is still legal doctrine, definitely within the EU. Since Brexit, will that doctrine still be applicable in the United Kingdom? I don't know. We would then have to see whether any public official of either country ends up in the United Kingdom. Obviously, the doctrine does not apply to ambassadors or embassy officials, or else this will cripple diplomacy completely. So there must have been an exception when that law was being made, that you won't pick an ambassador coming out of a diplomatic dinner for something his country, was doing somewhere else. In conclusion, I will say this is something like every doctrine that will be used against smaller powers. You won't dare arrest a former American president. You won't dare arrest a former Israeli prime minister. Uh, but an African head of state or foreign minister or minister of justice, for that matter, may become a victim to this legal doctrine of universal jurisdiction.
Thank you for that, sir. Um, we have about 6 minutes to go, but there's a question here. And this has to do with the United Kingdom and her foreign policy posture. Some analyst has said the EU may have misjudged the United Kingdom's approach to foreign policy. And they're talking specifically about one, the AUKUS deal that's been done, probably caught them by surprise, the relationship between the United Kingdom and Turkey. They're also seeing some synergy going on between the UK and Turkey because of the deal that they signed last year. And my question to you is this, sir. Do you see anything really standing out about the United Kingdom's foreign policy, whether with the EU or we're looking at it in the context of what they've done with the US and Australia? Is there anything that's really standing out in the approach that the UK is taking?
Yes, there is. And it shouldn't catch anybody by surprise because the argument that was made to justify Brexit is that the United Kingdom will be able to chart its own course in world affairs, and that course will be determined by the interests of the United Kingdom without having to dovetail that interest into the interest of 27. Maybe dovetail is not the word, dilute its interest into the interests of 27 other countries who may not have the same, who may not need the same narrative or approach on this, on any issue that comes up. Boris Johnson promised that. Every prime minister who's had to deal, even during the argument on Brexit, promised that. And they needed to deliver on that. They needed to be able to show the British people we are signing new agreements with Turkey. We are signing new agreements with Australia. We are signing new trade agreements with Great Britain. They need to do that because once Brexit took place, actually some of the documents which protected British interests while in the EU were no longer applicable, and Britain needed to find new approaches and new friendships and new memoranda of understanding with several other countries. And they've been very active at pushing all of that. Obviously, what the ones that will really be the icing on the cake will be a good trade agreement with the United States. But Obama warned them that, even though we say we have a special relationship, you are not going to jump the queue. They thought it will happen under Trump. It didn't. And definitely under Biden, there are going to be problems, especially as Biden is keeping a very, strong eye or pay strong attention on the Northern Ireland issue. If British relationship with the EU comes a cropper over whether, where you draw that customs boundary affects the Good Friday Agreement, don't expect Biden to support Britain. He is a strong supporter of the Good Friday Agreement. But Britain is pushing ahead on firing on all cylinders with several countries in the world to get good trade agreements that will allow British exports to go into those countries.
Thank you for that, sir. Um, we've run out of time, and we have to end the program now. However, I'm going to prep for next week. The war of words between Poland and the EU has been escalating. You talked about it last week. You said Poland was wrong. They signed up to the agreement. But now there's an escalation in the war of words. Would like to hear your input on that and if your mind has changed from last week. But on that note, I want to thank our viewers for being here this evening. Thank you for the comments online and some of the questions across some of the channels. Thank you for that. And sir, thank you very much. We'll see you again next week.
Thank you, Wakanda.
Thank you, sir.